So looks like we're just about ready here with William Blair, and we've got some slides coming up. So if I can ask our producer to pull the slides up, and I will say a little bit about Dr. Blair.
Well, I may be actually coming up here. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. William Blair, who joins us tonight, is the Walter L. and Helen P. Ferree Professor Emeritus of Middle American History at Penn State University. Before that, he was at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where I almost overlapped him when I was there getting my master's. But we are glad to have him with us. Welcome, Bill. We're glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Sort
Good.
of.
Good. Yeah. Well, we're glad to have you. We many of the audience probably knows that we just finished up our Civil War Symposium on April 8th and 9th. And so this is another Civil War topic, kind of the last part of our Civil War offerings for the month, which we do every April, and we will be doing that again next April as well. But we're glad to have Bill on here with us tonight from Pennsylvania, and all of you in the audience tonight. Looks like we've got folks from DC and Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, Key West, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona, Silver Spring, Maryland. So all over the place, and we're glad to have everybody in the audience with us tonight. So Bill, we've got your slides up here. So with another welcome, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we want you to talk to us about your new book, The Fight Over Truth at the Dawn of Reconstruction. So thank you.
Oh, well, nice to be here. This book actually began almost 30 years ago. And I was a young graduate student then, and I was in the Alderman Library in the University of Virginia. So not all that far from you all down there. And I was just looking around, trying to figure out what else I could see. And I pulled down this reel, this microfilm reel. And this is what I saw when I loaded it onto the microfilm or onto the reader. It said, it was a collection for Virginia from the Freedmen's Bureau, and it said records relating to murders and outrages. And I looked at that for a while, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Murders and outrages. It was a government document. It suggested that there had been atrocities that were committed. Because it was the Freedmen's Bureau papers, I knew it was targeting African Americans. But I didn't know why this thing existed, and I really didn't even understand at the time if it even had any use. Was it just collected, or was this being used for some particular purpose? And I went on to other things, frankly, from there. And it took me a while to even pick up interest again. But then I saw the project that was done online for the Freedmen's Bureau online. And here it was, again, Murders and Outrages. And it posted probably about 50%, a little more than 50% of the material that was contained in the National Archives. And so I even used this in classrooms with students who found it amazing for learning about Reconstruction. But I still didn't know, and it still bugged me, how did this record come into being and what was it used for? So I finally decided to conduct a detective hunt to try to learn who had called for the reporting of racial violence and why did they? And the answer is going to be actually looking really good for the Army. They're really some of the heroes in this story. I learned that the record came about because of a toxic political climate that caused information on racial violence to become politicized, with the usual sources like newspaper accounts being dismissed by opponents as fictions that were masking a political agenda. Democrats chastised radical Republicans who favored more expansive Black rights for fabricating these reports of racial atrocities, and they were accusing them of doing so they could enforce Black male suffrage on the South, and thereby they could infuse their sectional party with new voters. Senator Charles Sumner for offering on the Senate floor accounts of violence in anonymous letters which he did. They were anonymous. And he was, like journalists today, protecting the identities of sources. But that practice opened into allegations that he forged accounts to justify an unprecedented expansion of federal power. And what's significant from this slide is it's not just the South that's doing this. As you can see, this is a headline from the New York Times. So Northerners even were skeptical about this. So the dispute over the truth about atrocities led military officers in the Freedmen's Bureau to begin to collect evidence of violence under this provocative title of the records relating to murders and outrages. And in doing this, military leaders like General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant sided with Republicans in Congress, and thereby they undercut President Johnson's plans for Reconstruction. The desire of these officers, thankfully, to protect civil rights overrode their sense even of constitutional norms. The heroes of this story are the freed people who refuse to accept a tainted legal system. And here you can see some of the conflicts that would arise in the South. They face coercion and murder when bringing their claims to military officers. Their efforts provided evidence, though, that they supported the suspension of civil authority in the South in favor of military rule and reorganized governments with universal male suffrage. The reporting that occurred also exposed the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It also factored in Congress revoking the admission of Georgia as a state, and it exposed the terrorism that lay behind the 1868 presidential election that included the executions of possibly 200 Black people in Louisiana. Now, before I go further, I need to make sure you know a little bit about the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was instituted in March of 1865 because the country believed, or the government believed, you had to help the enslaved people make their way to freedom in some fashion. So it was set up to put military officers in communities throughout the South. Usually captains were in charge of particular districts. They could hire civilians as well to help them, but it was a military adventure, and it was under the War Department. So they were looking at labor contracts, making sure that they were drawn up well and that they were abided by on both parties. They started schools, as you can see in this slide. They also started hospitals, and kind of down on the list at first, they were supposed to kind of monitor justice that was going on in the South, whether civil law was being enforced or not. Well, that gives you just a little background now. And now we want to try to jump back and say, one of the things that's hard for us maybe to understand is just what an information deficit existed right after the Civil War. Northerners were starved for information about the South. They wanted to know a host of things. You know, what was the extent of destruction? What was the condition of battlefields? What was the possibility of economic recovery? Could white people and Black people get along together in peace? And remember, they didn't have television feeds or social media videos that could show violence as it happened. They had to rely on textual reporting by eyewitnesses in letters or newspapermen and political figures. And much of this, of course, was expected to be. Even President Johnson wanted more information. He complained that he was, quote, always obliged to act in the dark, unquote. And so he met in midsummer with former Union General Carl Schurz to ask him to report on the Southern conditions. It was kind of a poor choice, actually, since Schurz was a radical Republican. During his trip, Schurz leaked his findings to the press before sending the final report to Johnson. Well, the president knew it contradicted his position, so he assigned General Grant to make a similar tour. And Grant's report contradicted Schurz. Schurz reported on disloyal feelings among whites and also violence against freed people. Grant stated that the former enemies were on the right path toward reunion. Well, it was Schurz who really, at this point, had his thumb on the pulse of the South. He quoted a report by a general in South Carolina, but he quoted a general in South Carolina who said they are shot and abused outside the immediate protection of our forces by men who announce their determination to take the law into their own hands in defiance of our authority. He also talked about such things as a woman slain trying to stop the whipping of her son, 5 freedmen murdered in Mississippi. This was not all of it. This is just kind of a sample of 100 pages of documentation that he was trying to supply. Not all of it about violence, but it did raise questions about the supposed loyalty of the South to the new reunion. One of my surprises, though, came with Grant's quick change into someone who was committed, very committed to justice for Black people. He quickly, within weeks, he regretted the conclusions of his report to Johnson. He had made a quick 5-day journey. His heart wasn't in it. But on Christmas Day of 1865, he then telegraphed generals in command of military departments throughout the South. This December 25th orders basically said, give me all known outrages occurring with your command since the surrender of the rebel armies, committed by white people against the Blacks, and the reverse. He didn't underline that, I did. I wanted that to be standing out because what he was trying to tease out or figure out is what the Democrats were saying was that any of the violence that occurred were white people defending themselves against Black outrages. So that's why he set up the order this way, because he wanted to try to find out really what was going on in the South. But what they started to find were increasing levels of atrocities. In March of 1866, in Kentucky and Tennessee, there were 23 beatings involving whippings, 4 beatings involving shootings, 2 robberies with shootings, 3 other robberies, 5 men shot and killed, 2 shot and wounded, 4 men beaten to death, 1 man beaten and, yes, roasted, 3 women raped, 2 men and families beaten and driven from homes, and 2 arsons. Mind you, this is just one little area of Kentucky and Tennessee, and for probably only about a 3-4 month period. Well, during 1866, the violence rose wherever you looked. These are very famous. Historians have known about this for a good long time. Memphis on May 1 through 4 of 1866. It actually started because of Black soldiers who were mustering out of the Union Army were basically accosted in the streets, and it started a conflagration. 46 Blacks ended up being killed, as well as 2 whites. And then, not much later, in July of 1866, another 34 Blacks are killed, along with 3 white people. As Grant starts to see this, it really does appall him. In this one, I find this quite remarkable, and I was really applauding him, frankly. In July of 1866, he issues this General Orders, number 44. In the first part of it, you can understand. As I show here, he said, arrest all charged with the commission of crimes and offenses against officers, agents, citizens, and inhabitants of the United States. That seems to be, first of all, putting the federal officers and so on at the forefront, which is fine. That's what he's worried about. However, he goes much further. Irrespective of color, in cases where the civil authorities have failed, neglected, or unable to arrest and bring such parties to trial. This is an amazing order, actually. If you could actually accuse him of insubordination because he's not following the policies of his commander-in-chief, and he was committing the army to actions that the president absolutely would not. In fact, Johnson in April had proclaimed the insurrection had ended and that civil authority had been restored. Consequently, these orders contradicted what the commander-in-chief had said. Well, despite the increasing evidence of these atrocities, it did not stop naysayers from dismissing the reports as exaggerated. Democrats and even some Republicans, and many of them Northerners, discredited accounts that freed people and loyalists were under consistent, vicious assault without recourse to the law. A significant step toward better documentation of racial conflict came again at the instigation of military officers. This was in September of 1866. O. Howard, who was the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, finally had had enough. He sent out a circular through his adjutant ordering subordinates to report, quote, the number of murders that have occurred in your district where freedmen have been victims, or parties according to the official record. And the object, he said quite bluntly, was to test the truth of statements that had been publicly made touching this matter, and to enable General Howard to give the facts. Well, he got a head start here, and that was going to allow him to act more quickly when people wanted more details about the administration of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That time came in January of 1867, but I want to pause here just for a second and give you some background for those of you who may not know. What was being debated at the time was military reconstruction. And what that meant was that radical Republicans especially, with some of their moderate friends coming on board, basically wanted to suspend all civil governments in every place but Tennessee. They also wanted to set up, there weren't going to be state authorities anymore. There were going to be 5 districts, military districts, ruled by generals. They were going to order the military to have registration of black voters, and those black voters were going to participate in the construction of new constitutions. And in order for those states to become Reconstruction and come back, according to this Military Reconstruction Act, they would have to ratify the 14th Amendment. Pretty stern stuff. So it was a big step that the country was going to take. And in January of 1867, the Senate actually sent the president a resolution asking for a report on the enforcement of the 1866 Civil Rights Act. They were debating this Reconstruction Act, and they really wanted to see whether there was a necessity for an increased military presence in the South. This leads us to Edwin Stanton. There's a famous cabinet meeting in February of 1867 where the administration had gone on record, Johnson said, of saying everything was fine, we're doing what we need to do, everybody is cooperating in the South. Well, at this particular cabinet meeting, Stanton really dropped a bombshell. He looked around at the table and he said, you know, I have a report from Howard and General Grant. That report shows at least 400 plus instances of violence occurring in the South. It was collected, by the way, by the Freedmen's Bureau. And he said, even more to the point, said, well, you know, you could try to suppress it, but I don't think that was going to work because, quote, there was little doubt that Congress had seen this, likely had copies. In other words, the report had been leaked already. And lo and behold, Grant was really one of the participants in this process. Grant had willingly jumped on board of this, and he tried to amp up the gathering of data on violence. And in January of 1867, he told O. Howard, this is what this is all about. I want this data. I want to know about this violence because I want to make a report showing that the courts in the rebel states afford no security to life or property of the classes here referred to, and to recommend that martial law be declared over such districts. Again, he was way out in front of a lot of people when it came to protecting civil rights, and he was frankly out of step with his president. So the record that was created that was going to be called the record, or the records relating to murders and outrages, was assembled deliberately to influence policymaking that defied the president. And this is what I meant when I said in the beginning that concern over civil rights overrode the norms of chains of command under the Constitution. the information was quickly put to use. Senator Henry Wilson, who was also the chair of the Military Affairs Committee, basically gave this report in Congress in a speech on February 19th. He gave this to the Senate, excuse me. And he just started ticking down what was going on. 375 murders. Virginia, 18 murders. By the way, those 18 murders were in one county only, and another 150 burglaries that occurred. North Carolina, 15 murders, and so on down the line. And he also mentioned Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas. And as you can see in the headline here, what they were saying was outrages in the South, a damning record. They were trying to say and make the case, we need the military to go in and restore order. And they had the data. They had the data from the Freedmen's Bureau. Yet, what is kind of frustrating for me as a researcher when I went back and looked at all this was just how vigorous was the denial that any of this was even occurring. As much as you could see the facts in front of you, or as you would see all of this information gathered in these reports, they still wouldn't necessarily believe it. And what's incredible here, again, is to pay attention. James R. Doolittle is from Wisconsin. Edgar Cowan is from Pennsylvania. Because the South was not actually seated in Congress yet, all of the criticism and all of the debate, the naysayers in Congress, were Northerners. As you can see, Doolittle called the information a gross exaggeration, the work of military officers whose ambition is to control the South, meaning they just want to go in and do what they want to do. Edgar Cowan ridiculed Wilson. He called him a little book. Wilson had this stuff written down in a pocket notebook, in which he has a catalog of cases that would have sunk Sodom and Gomorrah. He has them all ticketed down. So he's just trying to dismiss it wholesale. Well, the radicals and moderates joined hands in the Republican Party, and they managed to pass this act anyway, and had to do it even over the presidential veto. So the record of murders and outrages changed the way that white and black activists even presented information on violence. No longer did they use anonymous accounts, and they did not rely primarily on partisan press. They deployed eyewitness testimony that was collected by Union military officers on the ground who presented specific information, giving names, victims, dates of crimes, localities, and whether any of the cases have been resolved. And this information helped moderates especially adopt a more radical position, allowing them to enact extreme policies that still could be considered constitutional because they met their prescribed duty under, if you look at Article 4, Section 4, Congress has the duty to guarantee that every state in this union have a Republican form of government. By that, they mean a government that not is Republican Party, but a representative government that enforces the law for all people. Well, that's how the record starts to come into being, but it goes on to have a life for about at least 3 years, and it'll finally pass after 1868 when the Freedmen's Bureau starts to stand down in many of the communities. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time just telling you what is in the record. Over 3+ years, as you can see by this, if you just look at the top line, incident reports, you can see all of the incident reports that talked about violence that was going on in the South. Over the 3+ years, officers filed almost 4,000 of these reports under this particular record called Murders and Outrages. Most of them spanned between 1866 through the end of 1868. The record contains the fate of perhaps 5,000. It contained multiple victims. So the totals won't quite match between the top row and down the bottom. For example, one account might account for a murder, a shooting, and a third person who escaped. So the one incident report would actually have 3 people in it. And in fact, I'll show you an incident report later that has hundreds of people in it, and it's just one report. Except for Louisiana, Physical assaults tended to be more numerous than murders. Assaults included knifings, whippings, burnings, beatings, or other physical contact that harmed the individual but fell short of death. Well, the greatest frequency of violence, as you can see from this record, came in the lower South, particularly Georgia, Louisiana, and especially Texas. The Lone Star State, as you did, a mind-boggling 288 incident reports, which was about 57% of all the hours. Murders there exceeded 800, and physical assaults 1,259. Whites who were killed outnumbered blacks, but only very narrowly. The whites were typically Union men, as they were called, meaning white people who either opposed secession, failed to back the Confederacy, or hailed from the North. Louisiana, if you look, had 507 incident reports, and then Georgia had 451. These two states drew special attention. It sparked extra investigative efforts by state officials because of the outcome of the presidential election of 1868. Both of these states had Republican majorities in them, yet both of them went Democrat. The record showed why. Terrorism had curbed black voting, and I'll have more on this later. For those of you who are familiar with the area, you might be puzzled, as I was, by Tennessee. Tennessee seems to have the least number of incident reports, yet we know that was the state that had the birthplace of the Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan emerged there in 1867-ish, by that point at least. But the answer to this contradiction, lies in Tennessee's quick reunion. Congress admitted the state in July of '66. So civil authority had been restored, and the government did not actually actively begin collecting information on the violence until 1868. And then it was being collected by two different entities, one the military departments and the Freedmen's Bureau, and they did not merge their data. If they had put them together, Tennessee would be really running neck and neck with Georgia. Although the remainder of the states fell lower in reports of violence, this does not suggest a peaceful accommodation to racial adjustment. Peculiarities in the data collection that account for the anomalies. Virginia, for example, contained former Whigs who avoided the imposition of radical Reconstruction by agreeing to black suffrage. So that way the white leaders hoped they could maintain home rule. They hoped to project peace. But I have to say that even so, they often failed to hold underlying tensions in check. Violence at times exploded in Virginia, even so, with the Freedmen's Bureau reporting 3 black churches burned in Petersburg in 1866, and terrorists also in Hampton, Virginia, burned houses, school buildings, and churches. Now, the record contains one mystery in that information from 3 states, Arkansas, Florida, and Mississippi, was never integrated into the report under Murders and Outrages. This just vexed me. I have no idea why that happened. I exchanged notes with an archivist at the National Archives who also had no explanation. He just supposed that the sheer size of the Freedmen's Bureau collection, which is more than 1,000 cubic feet long, would make it likely that similar records could exist apart from this main report. But this means that the geographic patterns of violence remain, incomplete. But more importantly, to me, it means that unlike what its critics claimed, instead of exaggerating the frequency of atrocities, the Bureau most certainly underreported incidents. Most officers actually thought they captured maybe only half of the actual cases, largely because of intimidation by white people. Well, several things struck me when I went through the material. So first off, even though I have been doing this, frankly, for 30 years, and was aware of the violence from the work of many fine historians, what I encountered in these records, frankly, still stunned me. There were moments when I felt like I was reading reports of terrorism committed by ISIS in the Mideast. I will just say that there were even decapitations of white and black men and women, and just leave it at that. Secondly, I was surprised, and I shouldn't have been, at how often women became targets of violence. Although representing only 15% of the incident reports overall, in some states, in fact, a handful of them, they constituted a third of the action. These certainly were underreported for all the reasons that crimes against women typically go overshadowed. I expected the sexual assaults and the attempts to pin down labor through violence, as well as just plain meanness, but I had not anticipated how freedom presented sometimes tragic circumstances for reconstituting families. It became clear in the record that an unknown number of these conflicts involved former masters trying to keep mixed-race children they had fathered with enslaved women through rape or sexual intimidation. In urban areas of the South, census takers in 1860 placed the number of mulattoes as high as 39%, and anywhere from 11 to 16% overall. And certainly in a society that's frowned upon amalgamation of the races, this had to be underreported. And as you could see in Virginia's case, for those of you who are in this state, I drew this out for you. The thing up at the top there is from the actual census, and can't see it too well. I wish I had a pointer, but there is actually a column that says color, and the M means mulatto. What this really tells you is that overall, about 1 out of every 5 black person was mixed race, declared mixed race. There probably were more. And so when you start to break up or have freedom, you have women who want to get away, want to take the children. You have men who either want to keep the child or want to hold the child so that they could keep the mother hostage, or again, maybe plain meanness, who knows. And a lot of the conflicts there were over this kind of situation. When it came to women's activism, I have to tell you what Virginia also featured an intriguing foreshadowing of the modern civil rights movement, an antecedent to Rosa Parks. On February 1, 1868, near Gordonsville, a railroad conductor evicted 3 black women from the train. The Freedmen's Bureau noted that they tried to file suit in U.S. District Court to take advantage of the Civil Rights Act. Legal papers have been filed and forwarded even to a U.S. District Attorney, but I have not found any resolution to the case. I even looked up old cases in LexisNexis and so on. But this showed that women were immediately seizing upon new legal mechanisms to push the boundaries of freedom, which echoed what was happening in places like San Francisco during the war, when black women were actually desegregating the streetcar system out there by the same kind of tactic. And then there were the massacres that one finds in the record. Studies of Reconstruction violence have featured urban areas where the reporting from newspapers and sources was prevalent. But the record here really tells us about what was going on in the countryside. And one incident of which has not found its way into the general scholarship of Reconstruction and has been overlooked actually in any of the recent reporting in the national press about massacres during Reconstruction. In the fall of 1868, a Union military officer supervising a region that included Bossier and Cato parishes in Louisiana speculated that white Southerners had killed perhaps 100 black people. The report mentioned that 9 freedmen, as you see here, were taken to the banks of the Red River, told to swim for their lives. They plunged in and then were shot when they rose to the surface. Assailants gunned down 3 freedmen, making a coffin for a murdered friend. The officer believed that perhaps another 70 free people had been killed in other parts of the parish. Gathering information remained difficult since terrorists threatened to kill the investigators. Well, the Slangs shows you the maps of where Bossier and Cato are located up in the northwest corner near Arkansas and Texas. The slayings began around October 1, as a white trader stopped to get corn at a place called Shady Grove Plantation in Bossier Parish. When he discerned that a black man would vote for Grant in the election, he leveled a weapon and fired, but fortunately missed. Black men rallied, they captured and bound him, but they left him unharmed. The news spread, as well as rumors that 2 white men had been killed. By the next morning, white people seeking vengeance escalated the violence to unimaginable proportions. White vigilantes streamed into Shady Grove to fire indiscriminately on freed people. They immediately shot down 8 men and 2 women. Both of the women killed for pleading for the wives of their husbands. Raiders took 7 men to a neighboring place and they killed 6. When they learned one had survived, they went back to finish the job, and so they killed his wife too. White assailants came upon a black man who refused to doff his hat. They put a chain around his neck, cut his throat, and hanged him on a tree where he stayed for 3 days. Mass executions were common. One historian has documented 185 deaths in these 2 parishes alone, with government records actually estimating perhaps 200 slain. The killing, we'll just never know the real total. The killing fields of 1868, though, showed the rest of the South the effectiveness of political terrorism. Murders and other intimidation limited Bossier and Cato parishes, which had 4,530 registered Republicans in both places, 4,530 registered Republicans. In both places, 2 votes, 45-30, 2 votes. This tragic episode might have been even lost to history were it not for the Freedmen's Bureau officers and the freed people who risked their lives to bear witness to the atrocities. Well, the story behind this record unfortunately also exposes how difficult it has been to overcome white disbelief of the scope of racist violence, not just then, but for at least another century. I had known about the racism that marked the historical profession for many years. Yet I have to say it was depressing to see how long the white historical establishment denied this part of our past. James Ford Rhodes is a famous historian of the 19th century. He just scorned the accounts of murders and outrages. And he stated, as you can see here, the subject was approached by the radicals with the desire to find facts to bolster up the policy which they had determined on, rather than to get at the exact truth. Naturally, the trouble was exaggerated. This was just one example of a drumbeat of a similar kind that lasted literally until the 1960s, when finally a turning point came when historian John A. Carpenter excoriated the profession for discounting the violence. By the 1970s, the tide then turned in the white mainstream scholarship. Today, virtually every study of Reconstruction uses the Freedmen's Bureau records, often consulting the records of murders and outrages, but with most of the historians until now not even knowing the story behind its origins and why the record existed. So I think I'm right in asserting that most Americans remain unaware of this story. And yet I think it's important to know this story to grasp the bigger picture, because the atrocities validated the necessity for government intervention then. Violence dictated the course of the Union and factored into the amending of our Constitution through the creation of the 14th Amendment and the protection of voting rights in the 15th Amendment. Now, these efforts obviously fell short and did not prevent the coming of segregation and disfranchisement. But if there is a hopeful story within this, it's that I think one of the first steps toward reconciling wrongs in the past is recovering personal stories and trying to account for the dead. Reconstruction-era Democrats, progressive-era historians, scoffed at the accounts produced by the Freedmen's Bureau in documenting racial injustice. But today, the records that reveal murders and outrages offer the possibility of confronting the past that otherwise may have been lost. And the bravery of the free people who risked their lives to provide this accounting put on record material that allows us to discredit the denial of these atrocities. This may not offer justice to the victims, but it has made it possible to acknowledge a record of wrongdoing, which I think is necessary to take just one of the many, many steps that lie ahead of us on the road toward racial reconciliation. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Bill, thank you very much for a powerful story, and we're glad that you have been researching this for so long, and finally, after 30 years of thinking about it and looking into it, you've come out with this story. We're very appreciative, and thank you for the presentation. We do have some questions from the audience. The first one, was the violence all encompassing throughout the entire former Confederacy, or have you found that there are concentrations in specific areas?
Well, as the chart I showed, a table I put up showed, it was the worst in Texas and the Deep South. Georgia, Texas, and Louisiana were probably the worst places. In fact, if you wanted to pick the worst place in the world to live as an African American at the time, it probably was in the Red River Valley, that region that spanned both Texas and Louisiana. Now, that does not say that there wasn't violence up around the other parts of the South, and it doesn't mean that it should be overlooked. It's just that those were the areas that were the worst. Now, the problem is that I end in 1868. When you get beyond that, you see the violence will shift. And when Grant is ahead of the curve, when he actually breaks up the first generation of the Ku Klux Klan, he does it by sending officers into North Carolina. So North Carolina and South Carolina shift after 1868 and become kind of centers of violence. So one of the things that would be wonderful if I could ever figure out how to do it is to show how violence flows and changes depending on local conditions and local areas. It's not always continuous at the same place at the same time.
When Grant ran for president, did he suffer any lack of support for his stance in favor of the freedmen?
Well, the white South didn't like him. And one of the reasons why more people in the white Southerners didn't vote against him was literally because a lot of them were being disqualified because of the 14th Amendment, and they were being disqualified because of loyalty. And there was a movement made by many in the white Southerners to boycott the elections. Functioning. So, yeah, a lot of, in that regard, the white South was not quite on board with Grant, would not vote for him, really. If it weren't for black voters in the South, he probably would have had a tougher row to hoe in terms of getting into the White House. But he also faced opposition in the North among Democrats. I haven't really looked at the vote totals, so I would hate to speculate what the percentages were, but let's say a significant minority in the North probably voted against him because of some of his stance on black suffrage.
So we have another question that's similar to that, along those lines you were just talking about. Are there any records of racial violence in the North for the same time?
Well, because you don't have as many black people in the North, not as much. You do have some, though, because of Philadelphia, for example. After the Civil War, Philadelphia became a hotbed of civil rights struggles. One of the first things that people tried to do there was desegregate the streetcar system in Philly. And then one of the most famous people, whose name has just gone out of my head, unfortunately, was actually executed as he was trying to vote. He was a civil rights leader and was executed while trying to vote on Election Day. So there were hot spots, but you just don't have as many black people in those areas. New York did have a significant population, Philly, Boston to an extent, but the kind of picture that we have of blacks in the North really took until the Great Migration that occurred in the late 19th century, or well, actually around World War One, when you finally got many more people in the North, Black people.
Were any U.S. military officers particularly effective in Reconstruction? Were there any that countered the violence effectively?
Yeah, one of the guys who was really strong about the violence, unfortunately, he couldn't do as much as he wanted to, was Phil Sheridan. I don't know, some of you in the audience probably have heard the quip that he gave, which was, if I owned, how does this go? If I owned both Texas and hell, I would live in hell and rent out Texas. And I used to think it was just a, a quip and a funny thing about Texans, meaning just, big egos or whatever. But he was speaking deliberately about the violence, and he really found it appalling. And he fought tooth and nail to try. He actually removed public officials from office. He went in there and really tried to do his darndest. And he resisted redistributing soldiers to the western part of the state, which is what the governor wanted, to fight Indians, because he knew it was a ruse to get the military out of the way so that they wouldn't be able to police the violence that was going on in the eastern part. So I give Phil Sheridan a lot of credit.
Yeah. So in an overall picture, how did Reconstruction in the South end?
Well, that's a good question. How did it end? Well, technically, it ended in 1870 in the sense that that's when the last state, Georgia, was readmitted to the Union. So for a lot of Northerners at the time, they believed that was it. We wipe our hands and we go on our merry way. Now, they did keep a certain amount of troop presence in the South. Not many, I think, maybe a couple thousand here and there, up until 1877. So for most historians, they think that 1877 is kind of ebb and flow. I mean, one of the things that's tough about Reconstruction is that you have some tremendous victories. You have Black rights expanded enormously, going from enslaved people to voting and holding political office. And then, of course, you have the backlash from the white establishment that tries to establish white supremacy. So it's a mixed picture, but the things that did happen in Reconstruction, especially legislatively and constitutionally, allowed for the flowering again of the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Thank you for joining us and spending some time tonight with us talking about Grant and Reconstruction and the unfortunate violence that happened in the South. I hope the best for your book, and I know it's been reviewed very well. I've seen it all over the place. Okay, everyone, thank you very much again, and we'll see you next time. Good evening.